The desert does not forgive. It does not bargain, and it certainly does not care about your bank account or your family name. In the scorched badlands of the Arizona Territory, 1884, a line was drawn in the sand between the civilized world and the wild unknown. But history is rarely written by the survivors. It is written by the winners. Today, we represent the story of Mia Vance, a woman left to rot by the very people she led, and Chayton, the son of an Apache war chief, who was raised to hate her kind. What happened between them in that canyon didn't just save a life. It exposed a conspiracy that would burn a town to the ground. This is the story of how mercy became the most dangerous weapon in the West. The sun over the Sonoran Desert was not a celestial body. It was a hammer. It beat down upon the cracked earth with a rhythmic, oppressive heat that turned the air into a shimmering curtain of distortion. In the deep, desolate stretch of land known as the Devil's Anvil, nothing moved at high noon, except for the vultures circling overhead and Chayton. Chayton, the 19-year-old son of the revered Chief Tallbear, moved through the scrub brush with the silence of a ghost. He was tracking a stray Mustang, but his attention was drawn upward to the black carrion birds spiraling in the cloudless blue. They were waiting for something to die. He adjusted the strap of his quiver, his dark eyes narrowing. This was Apache land by heritage, but by law, the white man's paper law. It was a forbidden zone, a buffer between the reservation and the booming mining town of Granite Springs. To be found here was to invite a bullet from a ranger's Winchester. Chayton crested a ridge of red sandstone, looking down into the dry wash below. He expected to see a coyote caught in a trap, or perhaps a calf that had wandered too far from the ranch lands. What he saw made him freeze. It was a bundle of rags, distinctively blue against the rust-colored dirt. A Victorian bustle dress, torn and covered in dust. A woman. She was lying face down in the sand, her arm outstretched as if reaching for the shade of a mesquite bush she had failed to reach. Chayton's first instinct, drilled into him by years of skirmishes and broken treaties, was to turn away. Let the desert take her, a voice in his head whispered. It was the voice of the elders who had seen their camps burned. A white woman in the Devil's Anvil meant trouble. If a search party found him near her body, he would hang before he could speak a word of defense. He turned his moccasin-clad foot to leave, but a sound stopped him, a dry, rasping cough. It was the sound of lungs fighting for one last breath. Chayton cursed softly in his native tongue. He looked at the horizon. No dust clouds. No riders. He scrambled down the scree slope, sliding in the loose rock until he reached the wash. When he rolled the body over, he was struck by two things. First, she was old, much older than the women he usually saw in the settlements. Her hair, matted with sweat and dirt, was a striking silver. Second, she had been beaten. Her lip was split, and a dark bruise bloomed across her cheekbone. This wasn't nature's doing. This was man's cruelty. Her eyelids fluttered, revealing pale, sun-blinded blue eyes. She couldn't focus. Her cracked lips moved, forming a word that made no sound. Water, Chayton murmured. He uncorked his water skin. He knew he shouldn't waste it. But he knelt, lifting her head. It was light, fragile as a bird's. He trickled a few drops onto her lips. She choked, coughed, and then greedily tried to suck at the skin. He pulled it back, pacing her. Slow, he said, his English thick but clear, or you drown. She blinked, her vision seemingly clearing for a fraction of a second. She saw his long black hair, the turquoise beads at his throat, the knife at his belt. Panic surged in her eyes. She tried to scramble back, but she had no strength. She collapsed, gripping his wrist with a hand that was surprisingly strong for a dying woman. "Thorn," she rasped, her voice like grinding stones. "Don't let Thorn have the deed." Chayton frowned. He knew the name. Silas Thorn, the mayor of Granite Springs, the man who owned the copper mines, the man who had petitioned the government to shrink the Apache hunting grounds last winter. "Thorn is not here," Chayton said, scanning the ridgeline. "You are alone." "Left me," she wheezed, "to rot." Chayton looked at the woman. She was dressed in fine silk, now ruined. She was someone of importance, yet she had been discarded like garbage in the worst part of the territory. If Silas Thorn wanted her dead, saving her was not just an act of kindness, it was an act of war. And Chayton, young and full of a warrior's fire, suddenly found the idea very appealing. He capped his water skin. He couldn't leave her here, and he couldn't take her to the reservation. It would bring the cavalry down on his father. He had to take her to the Blind Caves, a series of hidden alcoves halfway up the canyon walls that only his people knew about. "I am Chayton," he told her, though he wasn't sure she could hear him anymore. He scooped her up. She weighed almost nothing. "If you die, you die, but not today." 3 days passed in the cool shadows of the Blind Caves. For the first 2, the woman, who Chayton learned was named Mia Vance, burned with a fever that terrified him. He used wet rags cooled in the hidden spring to dampen her forehead. He crushed willow bark for the pain and forced her to drink broth made from dried venison. He watched her sleep, his rifle across his knees. He knew who she was now. The realization had come when he cleaned the dirt from a silver locket she wore. Inside was a picture of Elias Vance, the cattle baron who had founded Granite Springs 30 years ago. He had died 2 years prior, leaving his widow the sole heir to the largest water rights in the county. Mia Vance was the queen of the territory, and the queen was currently shivering on a pile of furs in an Apache hideout. On the morning of the 3rd day, the fever broke. Chayton was sharpening his knife when he felt eyes on him. He looked up. Mia was awake, propped up on one elbow, watching him with a clarity that was unsettling. "You're the chief's son," she said. It wasn't a question. Her voice was weak, but the authority in it was unmistakable. Chayton stopped sharpening. "You know me?" "I know your father, Tall Bear. We signed a treaty regarding the Salt River crossing 5 years ago. I stood next to my husband when we shook his hand." She tried to sit up further, but winced, clutching her side. "Where am I?" "Safe," Chayton said. "Hidden." "Hidden from Thorn?" "For now." Mia let out a bitter, dry laugh that turned into a cough. "He thinks I'm dead. He must. He watched his men drive the carriage into the wastes and dump me out. Told me to walk home." Chayton stood up and walked to the cave entrance, looking out over the vast expanse of red rock. "Silas Thorn is a powerful man. Why kill a widow? Why not just buy your land?" "Because I wouldn't sell," Mia spat. The fire in her eyes was returning. "Granite Springs is running dry, boy. The copper mines use too much water. Thorn needs the Vance aquifer, my aquifer. He offered me money. I refused. He offered me shares in the mine. I refused. So, he forged a letter claiming I had gone senile, declared himself emergency executor of the estate, and decided to facilitate a tragic accident for me in the desert." She looked down at her torn hands. "He thinks the desert will hide his crime." He thinks the vultures will pick the bones clean, and he can mourn me at a closed casket funeral next Sunday. Chayton looked at her. He saw the hatred in her face, a hatred that mirrored his own people's feelings toward the encroaching settlements. But he also saw opportunity. If you go back, Chayton said, he will finish the job. If I go back, Mia corrected, her jaw setting, I will hang him. She reached into her corset and pulled out a folded, sweat-stained leather pouch. He searched my bags. He searched the carriage, but he didn't check the lining of my dress. This is the original land grant, signed by the governor in 1860. It proves the water belongs to the Vance estate, and it has a clause. If I die under suspicious circumstances, the land reverts to the federal government, not the town. Chayton understood. Thorne needs the deed to change the clause. He needs you dead, but he needs this paper first. He made a mistake dumping you before he found it. He's arrogant, Mia said. He thinks an old woman is helpless. She looked at Chayton. I need to get back to Granite Springs. I need to get to Judge Blackwood. He's the only honest man left on the bench, but he rides the circuit. He'll be in town in 2 days for the monthly hearings. 2 days, Chayton shook his head. It is a day's ride, and Thorne's men are patrolling the border. They will shoot an Apache on sight, and they will shoot you if they see you alive. Mia Vance looked at the young warrior. She saw the hesitation, but she also saw the pride. She knew the politics of the land better than anyone. Chayton, she said softly. Thorne plans to dam the river if he gets my land. He plans to cut off the flow to the reservation completely. He calls it progress. If he wins, your people die of thirst just as surely as I almost did. The air in the cave grew heavy. Chayton knew she was telling the truth. The streams had been getting lower every month. I cannot walk into Granite Springs, Chayton said. I am an Indian. No, Mia said, a scheming glint appearing in her eye. You can't walk in as an Indian, but you can walk in as my prisoner. Chayton's eyes widened. What? Thorne has a bounty on hostiles, doesn't he? Mia sat up, ignoring the pain. If I drive a wagon into town, a battered, dying old woman who managed to capture a savage who tried to kill her, no one will look twice at me. They'll be too busy cheering for the brave widow. It gets us right to the courthouse steps. You want me to let you tie me up? Chayton asked, offended. I want us to survive, Mia said. We have a common enemy, Chayton. Thorne took my life, and he's trying to take your future. Help me destroy him. Chayton looked at the old woman. She was frail, battered, and near death. Yet she was plotting a coup that would shake the territory. He grinned. It was a dangerous, foolish plan. It was exactly the kind of thing his father would have forbidden. We need a wagon, Chayton said. Getting a wagon was not a matter of purchase. It was a matter of theft. Chayton left Mia in the cave for 6 hours. When he returned, he was leading a mule and a rickety buckboard wagon he had borrowed from a prospector's camp near the river. The prospector had been drunk asleep. He wouldn't miss it until noon, and by then, they would be miles away. The journey down from the high country was grueling. Mia was still weak. Her body racked with pain every time the wagon hit a rut. Chayton drove, wearing a heavy duster coat he had found in the wagon to obscure his features from a distance. As they neared the outskirts of Granite Springs, the landscape changed. The pristine desert gave way to the ugly scars of industry. Massive wooden derricks, piles of slag, and the muddy slurry of mining runoff. Look at it, Mia murmured from the back of the wagon, where she lay hidden under a tarp. My husband built a ranch. Thorn built a graveyard. We are close to the checkpoints, Chayton warned. We must do this now. They stopped in a copse of cottonwood trees. The transformation began. Mia tore her dress further, rubbed dirt into her hair, and made herself look even more deranged and desperate than she was. Then came the hard part. She took a length of rope. Hands behind your back, Chayton. Chayton hesitated. To be bound was a deep psychological blow for an Apache warrior. It was a symbol of defeat. He looked at Mia. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the effort of holding the rope. Do it, he said, turning around. She tied the knots. They were loose enough that he could break them if he twisted his wrists hard, but they looked tight. She tied a loop around his neck, treating him like a captured dog. It was degrading. It made his blood boil. I will not forget this, Chayton muttered. If this works, Mia whispered, you will be the hero of the story, not the victim. I promise you. She climbed into the driver's seat, hunched over, clutching the reins with skeletal hands. Chayton sat in the back, head bowed, playing the part of the defeated warrior. They hit the main road just as the sun began to set, casting long blood-red shadows across the town of Granite Springs. The first checkpoint was manned by 2 of Thorn's hired guns, men who wore badges but had the eyes of outlaws. One of them, a man with a jagged scar across his nose named Pike, stepped out, blocking the road. "Hold it there, Grandma," Pike sneered. "Road's closed for the night. Mayor's orders." Mia looked up. She channeled every ounce of pain and rage into her performance. She didn't look like the wealthy Mia Vance. She looked like a witch from a folklore tale. "Out of my way," she shrieked, her voice cracking. "I want the bounty. I caught him, the devil who killed my husband." Pike blinked, stepping closer. He squinted at the woman. "Mrs. Vance?" "I said move," Mia screamed, whipping the reins. The mule jerked forward. "He tried to scalp me in the night, but I got him. I got the heathen." Pike looked into the back of the wagon. He saw Chayton, head down, hair covering his face, rope around his neck. Pike laughed. It was a cruel, mocking sound. "Well, I'll be damned," Pike shouted to his partner. "The crazy widow actually caught a buck. Looks like she survived the desert after all." "Let her through," the partner called out, spitting tobacco. "Mayor Thorn will want to see this. He's at the saloon entertaining the judge." Pike stepped back, tipping his hat mockingly. "Go on then, Mrs. Vance. Drive your prize to the slaughter." Mia didn't acknowledge him. She snapped the reins, and the wagon rattled into the main street of Granite Springs. The town was busy. Miners, whores, and cattlemen filled the wooden sidewalks. The sight of the battered buckboard and the screaming old woman drawing a captured Apache stopped the music in the salons. People spilled out onto the street. Whispers turned to shouts. "Is that Mia Vance? She looks half dead. Look, she's got an Indian." Chayton kept his head down, watching through the curtain of his hair. He saw the faces of the crowd. Anger, fear, curiosity. He was the enemy here. If Mia's plan failed, this crowd would tear him apart before the rope even went over the tree limb. Mia pulled the wagon to a halt right in front of the Silver Star Saloon. The double doors swung open. Silas Thorne stepped out. He was a large man, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit, a gold watch chain gleaming on his vest. He held a cigar in one hand and a glass of whiskey in the other. Beside him stood Judge Blackwood, a stern man with mutton-chop whiskers and a Bible in his pocket. Thorne's face went pale. The cigar slipped from his fingers. He looked as if he had seen a ghost. "Mia?" Thorne stammered. We were told you had perished." Mia stood up in the wagon. She looked magnificent in her ruin. She pointed a shaking finger at Thorne. "You'd like that, wouldn't you, Silas?" Her voice rang out, clear and sharp, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "You'd like to bury me and steal my water." "She's delirious," Thorne shouted quickly, turning to the crowd. "The heat has scrambled her mind. Someone help her down." "I am not delirious," Mia shouted. She reached back and yanked the rope, pulling Chayton's head up. "I have returned, and I brought a witness." Thorne's eyes narrowed. He looked at Chayton. "A savage? You think the word of a savage holds weight in my town?" "Not his word," Mia said, a dangerous smile touching her lips. "His eyes." She looked at Judge Blackwood. "Judge, I demand an emergency hearing. Right now. In the street if need be. I am charging Silas Thorne with attempted murder and fraud." The crowd gasped. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. Thorne's hand drifted toward the revolver tucked inside his jacket. "This is absurd," Thorne growled. "Sheriff, arrest this woman for public disturbance and take that Indian to the jail. We'll hang him at dawn." Sheriff Brody, a man who owed his badge to Thorne, stepped forward, hand on his gun. "Wait." The shout came from Chayton. He didn't speak like a savage. He spoke with the calm, booming resonance of his father. He stood up in the wagon, shedding the persona of the defeated prisoner. He twisted his wrists. The ropes, which looked tight, fell away instantly. The crowd stepped back in shock. An unbound Apache in the middle of town. "I am Chayton, son of Tall Bear," he announced, "and I did not try to kill this woman. I found her where he left her." He pointed a bronze finger at Thorne. "In the devil's anvil, left to die so he could steal the water that feeds your town." Thorne panicked. "Kill him! He's loose! Kill him!" Sheriff Brody drew his gun. Bang! The shot rang out, but it didn't come from the sheriff. It came from the balcony of the hotel across the street. A rifle shot kicked up the dirt right at the sheriff's feet. "Everyone stand down." High above, a man in a dusty coat lowered a Winchester. It was the frantic prospector whose wagon they had stolen, but he wasn't alone. Behind him were 3 other miners. "Let them speak, Thorne," the prospector yelled. "If you tried to dry up the river, we all want to hear about it." The town of Granite Springs was built on secrets, but tonight the dam was breaking. Mia Vance stood tall in the wagon, Chayton at her back, an unlikely alliance of the old world and the new, facing down the corruption that threatened to swallow them both. But Silas Thorne was not a man to give up power easily. He signaled to his men on the rooftops. The trial hadn't even started, and the war was about to begin. The standoff on Main Street did not result in a massacre, largely due to the intervention of Judge Blackwood. A man of iron principles and zero tolerance for vigilante justice, he ordered the street cleared and the hearing to commence immediately within the town hall. It was irregular, highly illegal by federal standards, but in the territory, the man with the gavel was God. The town hall was a stifling, windowless box of pine and dust. Every bench was packed. Miners with coal-stained faces sat shoulder to shoulder with ranch hands and shopkeepers. At the front, Silas Thorne sat with his lawyer, a weasel of a man named Percival Gray. On the other side sat Mia Vance, looking like a ruin of royalty in her torn dress, and Chayton, who stood stoically with his arms crossed, refusing to sit in the defendant's chair. Judge Blackwood slammed his gavel, the sound cracking like a gunshot in the humid room. "This is an emergency hearing regarding the competency of Mrs. Mia Vance and the disposition of the Vance estate," Blackwood announced. "Mayor Thorne, you claim Mrs. Vance is mentally unfit and that you acted as executor in her best interest." Thorne stood up, buttoning his jacket. He had regained his composure. He was a politician after all. Lying was as natural to him as breathing. "Your Honor," Thorne began, his voice smooth as oil. "It breaks my heart to see Mia in this state. Look at her. She wanders the desert, consorts with hostiles, and invents wild conspiracy theories. Dr. Aris, the town physician, will testify that he diagnosed her with early-onset dementia 2 weeks ago. I sent her to a sanatorium in Tucson for her own safety. The carriage must have been attacked by this savage." He gestured dismissively at Chayton. "He likely killed the driver and held her for ransom, feeding her these lies." The crowd murmured. It was a plausible story. It played into their fears of the Apache and their respect for the mayor. Chayton's jaw tightened. He wanted to speak, to tell them that Thorne was a snake, but he knew his voice held no weight here. He looked at Mia. She was staring at the table, her hands trembling. Was she breaking? Had the exhaustion finally taken her? Then, Mia stood up. She didn't use the table for support. She stood on her own 2 feet, drawing herself up to her full height. "A sanatorium?" Mia asked quietly. Her voice grew louder, filling the room. "You sent me to a grave, Silas, and you made a mistake. You forgot that my husband, Elias, didn't just leave me land. He left me his ledgers." She reached into the bodice of her dress, pulling out not the deed, but a small black notebook. It was water-stained and battered. Thorne's eyes went wide. He recognized it. "I found this in the safe before your men dragged me out," Mia said, holding it up for the jury, 12 men picked from the saloon. "This details the bribes Mayor Thorne paid to the Railway Commission. It details the falsified geological surveys claiming the reservation land was barren so he could buy it for pennies. And..." She flipped a page, her finger trembling with rage. "It details the payment of $500 to a man named Pike to dispose of a problematic widow." The courtroom exploded. Percival Gray jumped up. "Objection! That book is a forgery, a mad woman's scribblings." "Is it?" Mia turned to the crowd. "Is Pike in this room?" Every head turned. Pike, the scarred gunman who had manned the checkpoint, was standing near the back exit. Seeing the attention turn to him, his nerve broke. He wasn't paid enough to hang for treason. He turned to run. "Stop him!" Sheriff Brody shouted, though he looked unsure of who to obey. Chayton moved. He didn't run. He vaulted over the railing of the spectator box, landing on the backs of the benches. He moved with the fluid grace of a mountain lion, stepping on shoulders and heads, ignoring the shouts. As Pike reached the door, Chayton launched himself through the air. He tackled the gunman, slamming him into the doorframe. The impact shook the building. Chayton pinned Pike to the floor, his forearm pressed against the man's throat. "Talk," Chayton growled, low enough for only Pike to hear. "Or I let the spirits take you now." Pike, gasping for air, looked up at the Apache's furious eyes, and then at the angry mob approaching. "Thorne," he wheezed. "Thorne paid me. He told me to dump her in the anvil. I swear." The confession rang out in the sudden silence of the hall. Judge Blackwood stood up, his face dark with fury. "Sheriff Brody, arrest Mayor Thorne immediately for conspiracy to commit murder." Thorne looked around wildly. His empire was crumbling in seconds. But Silas Thorne was not a man who relied solely on the law. He relied on insurance. "You fools!" Thorne screamed, backing away as the sheriff approached. "You think you can arrest me? I am this town, and if I go down, Granite Springs burns with me." Suddenly, a massive explosion rocked the foundation of the hall. The windows blew inward in a shower of glass. The oil lamp swinging from the ceiling crashed down, igniting the dry wood of the floor. Thorne's contingency plan had been activated. His men at the mine had blown the dynamite stores near the water tower. Chaos erupted. Smoke filled the room instantly. In the confusion, Thorne kicked the sheriff in the knee and vanished into the thick, choking gray cloud. "Chayton!" Mia screamed, coughing as the smoke swallowed her. Chayton released Pike and spun around. The courtroom was a stampede of terrified people. He couldn't see Mia. He dropped to his hands and knees, crawling under the smoke, relying on his tracking senses amidst the chaos of civilization. He found her by the judge's bench, trapped under a fallen beam. He heaved the wood aside, his muscles straining, and hauled her up. "We have to go," he choked out. "The building is dying." They stumbled out the back exit into the alleyway. The night sky was lit up with orange flames. The water tower had collapsed, and the streets were flooding with mud, while the town hall burned. "He got away," Mia wept, wiping soot from her face. "He's going to the mine. He's going to destroy the evidence." "Let him run," Chayton said, checking his rifle. "A wolf runs fastest when it is scared. That is when it falls into the trap." The chase did not happen on horseback. The explosion had spooked the animals, scattering them into the night. It was a foot chase, brutal and intimate, leading away from the burning town and up toward the Copper Ridge mines. Thorne had a head start, but he was a man of soft living, weighed down by his suit and his panic. Chayton and Mia followed. Mia was fueled by an adrenaline that defied her age, and Chayton moved with the relentless pace of a hunter. They tracked him to the main office of the Copper Ridge Mining Company, a hulking wooden structure perched precariously over the strip-mined canyon. Inside, the lights were on. Chayton signaled for Mia to stay back behind a stack of crates. "I will flush him out." "No," Mia whispered, gripping his arm. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small Derringer pistol she had taken from the sheriff's belt during the confusion in the hall. "We finished this together. This is my fight, too." Chayton looked at the small gun, then at the fierce woman holding it. He nodded. "Stay low." They entered the warehouse. It was a labyrinth of machinery, conveyor belts, and steam engines. The air smelled of sulfur and grease. "Thorne!" Mia's voice echoed through the metal rafters. "It's over. The judge knows. The town knows." A gunshot ricocheted off a steel beam near Chayton's head. He rolled behind a boiler. "You think I care about the town?" Thorne's voice drifted down from the upper catwalks. He sounded unhinged. "I built this place from dirt. It's mine to burn." Chayton spotted movement above, a shadow against the moonlight filtering through the skylight. He raised his rifle, but he didn't have a clear shot. "You didn't build it," Mia shouted, moving to a different cover to draw his fire. "You stole it, just like you tried to steal the reservation land." "The reservation?" Thorne laughed, a manic, echoing sound. "You think this is about land? Ask your Apache friend about his father. Ask him about the Treaty of the Black Canyon." Chayton froze. The Treaty of the Black Canyon was a story told by the elders, a peace meeting 10 years ago that turned into an ambush. Many braves had died. His father, Tall Bear, had barely escaped with his life. The Apaches had always blamed the cavalry. "What do you mean?" Chayton shouted, stepping out from cover. "The cavalry didn't order that attack," Thorne yelled, firing another shot that pinged off the boiler. "I did. I paid a mercenary unit to dress in blues and slaughter them. I needed a war to scare the investors into funding the mine. Fear sells copper, boy. Fear sells safety." The revelation hit Chayton like a physical blow. The hatred he had carried for the white soldiers, the war that had defined his childhood, it was all manufactured by this one man for profit. The rage that surged through Chayton was blinding. He abandoned caution. He didn't shoot. He wanted to feel the life leave Thorne with his hands. He scrambled up the ladder to the catwalk. Thorne saw him coming and fired his revolver. Click, empty. Thorne threw the gun at Chayton and turned to run along the narrow metal walkway. Chayton was faster. He tackled Thorne, and they both crashed into the railing. The rusted metal groaned under their weight. They grappled violently. Thorne was heavy and desperate, gouging at Chayton's eyes. Chayton was younger and stronger, landing heavy blows to Thorne's ribs. "You killed my people for money," Chayton screamed, landing a punch that shattered Thorne's nose. Thorne flailed, grabbing a heavy wrench from a nearby toolbox. He swung it, catching Chayton in the shoulder. Chayton roared in pain, his grip loosening. Thorne kicked him hard in the chest, sending the young Apache skidding backward. Chayton's legs tangled in the railing, and he fell, catching himself by one hand, dangling over the dark abyss of the mine shaft below. Thorne stood over him, chest heaving, blood streaming down his face. He raised the wrench for a killing blow. "Goodbye, savage." Crack. The sound was small, sharp, and final. Thorne stiffened. He dropped the wrench. He looked down at his chest, where a small red blossom was spreading on his white shirt. He looked up, across the warehouse. Mia Vance stood on top of a steam engine, the smoking derringer held steady in both hands. She wasn't shaking anymore. Thorne stumbled backward. He hit the railing. It gave way. There was no scream, just the sound of a body hitting the supports on the way down, and then silence. Chayton pulled himself up, gasping for breath, clutching his injured shoulder. He looked down into the black pit, then across at Mia. She lowered the gun. She looked tired, older than she had ever looked, but she was alive. The death of Silas Thorne did not fix Granite Springs overnight, but it broke the dam of corruption that had held the town hostage. The following morning, the sun rose over a town that was battered but breathing. The fire had been contained, though the town hall was ash. Sheriff Brody had fled the county, and Judge Blackwood had taken temporary control of the administration. Mia sat on the porch of the doctor's office, her arm in a sling, watching the street. Chayton sat on the steps below her. He was cleaning his rifle, a rhythmic, soothing motion. "They found the deed," Mia said softly, "in his safe, and the letters to the mercenaries." Chayton nodded, not looking up. "The elders will want to see them. It will not bring back the dead, but it will bring the truth. Truth settles the spirit." "I'm signing the water rights over," Mia said suddenly. Chayton stopped cleaning. He looked at her. "To who?" "To a trust," she said, looking out at the desert horizon. "Managed jointly by the town council and the tribal elders. Half the water goes to the farms, half flows to the reservation. Forever. It can never be sold. It can never be damned without both signatures." Chayton looked at this woman, this enemy he had been raised to hate. He saw the strength in her. "My father will not believe it," Chayton said. He thinks the white heart is made of stone. Then bring him to me, Mia smiled, a genuine warm smile. I'll make him tea, and I'll show him that even stones can crack. Just then, a commotion arose at the end of the street. Dust clouds billowed. People were running inside, shouting alarms. Riders, someone yelled. Apaches! Chayton stood up, gripping his rifle. He looked toward the edge of town. A line of mounted warriors sat on the ridge, silhouetted against the sun. At the center sat Tall Bear, wearing his war bonnet, his face painted for battle. He had come for his son. The townspeople grabbed their guns. The tension that had dissipated with Thorn's death returned in a heartbeat. One shot would start a war that would burn Granite Springs to the ground. Chayton looked at Mia. Stay here. No, Mia said, standing up painfully. I'm done hiding. She walked down the steps, past Chayton, and into the middle of the dusty street. She walked until she was between the line of nervous townsfolk and the line of Apache warriors. Tall Bear, she shouted, her voice raspy but loud. The chief looked down at the old woman. He raised his lance. The warriors tensed. Chayton ran up to stand beside her. He raised his hand, palm out, a sign of peace to his father. Father, Chayton called out in Apache, there is no fight here. The snake is dead. This woman, she killed him. She saved me. Tall Bear lowered his lance slightly. He looked at his son, seeing the bruises, the soot, and the way he stood protectively next to the white woman. He looked at Mia Vance. Mia reached into her pocket and pulled out the rolled parchment, the new water agreement she had drafted with the judge that morning. She held it up. The water is yours, she said, as much as it is ours. Come down, Tall Bear. Let us drink as neighbors. For a long, agonizing minute, the only sound was the wind whistling through the telegraph wires. Then, Tall Bear drove his lance into the ground, a sign of truce. He dismounted. As the chief walked toward the widow, the clouds that had been gathering all morning finally broke. It started to rain. It was a rare, heavy desert rain, washing away the blood, the soot, and the dust of the last few days. 6 months had passed since the fire that consumed the town hall, and the desert was beginning to forget. The scorching heat that had once baked the devil's anvil into a lifeless purgatory had softened, tempered by the autumn winds drifting down from the Dragoon Mountains. But while the land healed in its slow geological silence, the town of Granite Springs was undergoing a transformation that was loud, messy, and entirely human. Chayton stood on the wooden boardwalk outside the newly rebuilt general store, watching the dust kick up in the main street. He leaned against a support post, his thumbs hooked into his belt. He wore a mixture of worlds that confused the newcomers and comforted the locals. Sturdy denim trousers and a collared shirt. But over it, he wore a buckskin vest beaded with the geometric patterns of his clan, and his hair remained long, bound with leather and turquoise. He wasn't just a spectator anymore. He was the linchpin. A wagon rattled past, piled high with sacks of grain. The driver, a bearded miner named Dutch, tipped his hat. Morning, Chayton. River's running high. High enough, Dutch. Chayton nodded back. Mind the crossing at Red Creek. The mud is deep. It was a simple exchange, but 6 months ago, Dutch would have spat at Chayton's feet, and Chayton would have been tempted to put an arrow in Dutch's shoulder. Now, they discussed river levels. It was a fragile piece, stitched together by necessity and the iron will of one woman, but it held. However, the piece was tested daily. A commotion erupted near the saloon, a shout, the crash of a chair, and the distinctive sound of a drawn Colt revolver. Chayton didn't flinch. He pushed off the post and walked calmly toward the noise. Inside the saloon, the air was thick with tobacco smoke and tension. A young, fresh-faced cowboy, new to the territory, judging by the shine on his boots, had his gun leveled at an Apache tracker named Kude, who was sitting at a corner table nursing a sarsaparilla. "I said move, Redskin," the cowboy snarled, his hand shaking slightly. "I don't drink with savages." The room had gone deadly quiet. The bartender looked at Chayton with pleading eyes. Kude, an older warrior who had ridden with Geronimo, simply stared at the boy with bored amusement, his hand resting near his knife. Chayton stepped between them. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't need to. He moved with a quiet, predatory confidence that sucked the oxygen out of the room. "Put the iron away, boy," Chayton said, his voice low and scraping like gravel. The cowboy blinked, looking at Chayton. "Who are you? You another one of them?" "I am the man who ensures you live to see supper," Chayton said, stepping closer until the barrel of the gun was inches from his chest. "In Granite Springs, we have a law. You draw a weapon in anger. You spend a week digging irrigation ditches in the sun. No trial, no bail." "I ain't digging no ditches," the cowboy spat, though he took a half step back. "This is America. We don't take orders from Indians." "You take orders from the Vance Trust," Chayton corrected him. "And the trust owns the water in your canteen. You want a drink in this town? You holster that gun and buy Kude around for the insult." The cowboy looked around the room for support. He found none. The miners, the ranchers, even the sheriff's new deputy, they all watched with stone faces. They knew the cost of the war that almost happened. They knew who had stopped it. Slowly, the cowboy lowered the hammer. He holstered the gun, threw a silver dollar on the table, and stormed out, his spurs jingling in the silence. Cootie nodded once to Chayton. "You sound like her," the old warrior grunted in Apache. "Like the white grandmother." Chayton allowed himself a small, tired smile. Someone has to. Later that afternoon, Chayton rode out of town, following the Salt River upstream. The transformation of the land was even more miraculous than the town. The irrigation canals, funded by the Vance Trust and dug by a mixed crew of Apache laborers and out-of-work miners, had turned the Dust Bowl into a patchwork of green. Alfalfa and corn swayed in the breeze where only mesquite had grown before. He reached the Vance Ranch just as the sun began its descent, painting the sandstone cliffs in hues of violent orange and bruising purple. The ranch house had been repaired. The scorched timber from the old raids had been replaced with fresh pine. He found Mia in the garden she had insisted on planting, despite the doctor's protests. She was sitting in a high-backed rocking chair, a heavy wool blanket draped over her legs despite the warmth of the afternoon. She had aged a decade in 6 months. The ordeal in the desert had burned through her reserves, leaving her frail and translucent, like a dried leaf held up to the light. Her once fierce blue eyes were cloudy, and her hands, resting on the blanket, trembled with a constant rhythmic palsy. Chayton tied his horse and walked up the path. He removed his hat, a gesture of respect he had learned was important to her. "You're late," Mia said, without opening her eyes. Her voice was thin, a whisper of the thunder it used to be. "I had to teach a lesson at the saloon," Chayton said, sitting on the wooden steps near her feet. "A greenhorn," Mia chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Did you shoot him?" "No, I made him buy Cootie a drink." "Good," she sighed, finally opening her eyes. She turned her head slowly to look at him. Bullets are easy, Chayton. Patience is the hard work. That's what Elias always used to say. The harvest will be good, Chayton said, changing the subject. He didn't like talking about the past. He wanted to give her news of the life she had saved. The corn is tall. My father says the spirits are pleased with the water treaty. Your father, Mia mused. That stubborn old goat. Has he forgiven me for stealing his son yet? He does not think you stole me, Chayton said softly. He looked out at the horizon. He thinks you finished raising me. Mia went quiet. Her hand moved, seeking his. Chayton reached up and took it. Her skin was paper thin, her grip weak, but there was still a warmth there that anchored him. I'm tired, Chayton, she whispered. The desert. I think it took more of me than I realized. It's coming back for the rest. Do not talk like that, Chayton said, his throat tightening. Dr. Eris says, with rest. Dr. Eris is a fool who thinks tea cures old age, Mia snapped with a flash of her old spirit, though it faded quickly. I know what is happening. I can feel the sun setting, boy, and I'm not afraid. I've done what I was meant to do. She squeezed his hand. When I found those ledgers, when I saw what Thorn was doing, I thought my life was over. I was a useless old widow. But you gave me a war to fight. You gave me a reason to stay alive in that canyon. You saved yourself, Chayton insisted. I only carried you. No. Mia shook her head slightly. You carried the future. Look at this valley, Chayton. Look at the green. That is us. That is you and me. We did that. She coughed, a racking spasm that shook her small frame. Chayton stood up to help her, to get water, but she waved him down. Promise me, she gasped, regaining her breath. Promise me you won't let them go back. Don't let Thorn's ghost win. If the miners get greedy, if your people get angry, I will hold the line, Chayton vowed. I swear it on my father's lance, and on your husband's Bible. Mia smiled, her eyes drifting shut again. That's a good mix, she murmured. A very good mix. She fell asleep in the chair as the sun dipped below the mountains. Chayton stayed on the steps, watching over her, his rifle across his knees, guarding the woman who had once been his enemy and was now the only mother he had left. She passed 3 days later, in the quiet hour before dawn. She didn't die in pain. Her maid found her in bed, looking as if she were merely sleeping, a slight smile on her face. The news traveled fast, faster than the telegraph. It moved on the wind. By noon, the church bells in Granite Springs began to toll. They rang out across the valley, a mournful, steady rhythm. Clang, clang, clang. Chayton was at the reservation when he heard them. He was breaking a colt in the corral. He stopped, the rope going slack in his hands. He looked toward the town, miles away. He knew. Tall Bear walked up to the fence. The chief looked old today, his face lined with sorrow. He respected strength above all things, and he had found a worthy adversary, an ally in the widow Vance. She has walked on, Tall Bear said in Apache. Yes, Chayton replied. She was a warrior, Tall Bear said. It was the highest praise he could give. Prepare your horse, we ride. The funeral of Mia Vance was a spectacle that would be written about in diaries and letters for 50 years. The cemetery of Granite Springs sat on a hill overlooking the town and the river valley. It was usually a segregated place. Protestants here, Catholics there, and no place for the non-believer. But today, the gates were wide open. The entire town had turned out. Miners washed the coal dust from their faces and wore their wedding suits. Ranchers stood holding their Stetsons against their chests. The women wept openly. They knew that without Mia Vance, their husbands would be out of work, and their town would be a dry, dead husk. Judge Blackwood stood by the open grave, reading from the scriptures. His voice was steady, but he had to pause to wipe his glasses. She was the mother of this valley, Blackwood said. She was the rock upon which the waters broke. We commit her body to the earth, but her spirit flows in the river. As he finished the prayer, a low rumble was heard. The ground vibrated. The townsfolk turned, fearful. Was it a stampede? A rock slide? Then they saw them. Cresting the ridge that lined the cemetery was a column of riders. Hundreds of them. It was the Apache Nation. They were not dressed for war. No face paint, no lances. They were dressed in their finest ceremonial buckskins, adorned with beads and silver. The townspeople tensed, hands drifting to belts, but Chayton stepped forward from the mourning party. He stood by the grave, dressed in a black suit, but with his moccasins on his feet. He raised a hand to the ridge. The riders stopped. They sat in silence, a magnificent, imposing wall of humanity against the blue sky. They did not come to raid. They came to witness. Tall Bear rode down alone. He guided his Mustang through the parted crowd of white settlers who stepped back in awe and fear. He rode right up to the grave. The chief dismounted. He looked at the coffin, made of polished oak and silver handles. He looked at Judge Blackwood and then at his son. Tall Bear reached into his saddlebag. He pulled out a blanket woven with intricate patterns of red, black, and white, the colors of the four directions, the colors of life and death. He stepped forward and laid the blanket over the coffin. "She gave water," Tall Bear said in English, his voice booming. "We give warmth for the long journey." He turned to Chayton. "Speak for her." Chayton looked at the crowd. He looked at the faces of the men who had once hunted him, and the faces of his cousins who had once hunted them. "When I found her," Chayton began, his voice cracking with emotion he fought to control. "She was dying in the dirt. She had nothing. No water. No hope. But she had a fire inside her that could burn down the world." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver locket she had worn, the one with her husband's picture. He had fixed the clasp for her months ago. "She told me that hate is easy," Chayton said. "She told me that mercy is the weapon of the strong. Mia Vance did not just save my life in the blind caves. She saved my soul. And she saved all of you." He dropped the locket onto the coffin. "Go in peace, grandmother," he whispered. "The water is safe." He then pulled a single eagle feather from inside his jacket, a feather he had earned on his first hunt, his most prized possession. He let it fall, spiraling down into the darkness of the grave until it rested on the Apache blanket. As the first shovels of dirt began to fall, a sound rose from the ridge. It was a song, a low, mournful chant from the throats of 300 warriors. It wasn't a war cry. It was the song of the going home, a melody that usually only accompanied great chiefs to the afterlife. The townspeople listened, mesmerized. The haunting, beautiful sound drifted over the valley, mixing with the sobs of the mourners, weaving together in the air, just as the two peoples were now woven together on the earth. Years turned into decades. The wooden markers in the cemetery rotted and were replaced by stone, but the legend of the Dryland only grew stronger. Granite Springs survived the end of the mining boom Because it had the water. The farms prospered. The reservation borders were respected, protected not by the cavalry, but by the legal ironclad of the Vance Trust. Chayton never left. He grew old in that valley. He married, had children, and his grandchildren grew up speaking both English and Apache. He became a man of two names. To the town, he was Mr. Vance's executor. To the tribe, he was Goyath, the one who bridges. Travelers who pass through the region today will still see it. In the center of the town square, there is a bronze statue. It does not depict a general on a horse or a politician with a scroll. It depicts an old woman in a tattered dress, sitting in a wagon, pointing a finger of accusation at the world. And standing behind her, a hand on her shoulder, is a young Apache warrior. Beneath the statue, there is a plaque. It reads simply, "Mia Vance and Chayton here. In the heat of the dryland, enemies became family. Water is life. Mercy is strength." And they say, on quiet nights when the moon is full over the Devil's Anvil, if you listen closely to the wind whistling through the canyons, you can't hear the sounds of battle anymore. You only hear the sound of a river flowing freely, and perhaps the soft, shared laughter of a boy and an old woman watching over their valley forever. And that brings us to the end of the saga of Mia and Chayton. It's a story that challenges the typical myths of the Wild West, showing us that the bravest thing a person can do isn't to pull a trigger, but to extend a hand. If this finale moved you, please hit that like button. It helps these stories reach more people. And if you haven't yet, subscribe and turn on notifications. I want to know your thoughts. Do you think Chayton made the right choice staying in the town? Or should he have returned fully to his people? Let's discuss it in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.